On June 12th, Israel began its devastating Operation Rising Lion against Iran. Several key Iranian officials were killed, with many of its nuclear sites also being targeted. Iran responded. Massive missile strikes over the weekend battered Israel. In Iran, 224 civilians have already been killed, according to CNN. Iran's missiles have damaged central Israel's power grid. War is upon the Middle East. And that leaves us with a question. What is the worst-case scenario that could come out of the war between Israel and Iran? That's the question the BBC posed on June 14th, and it came up with 5 potential scenarios, each with massive implications for Israel, Iran, and the rest of the world. The first scenario is simple. The United States decides to get involved. That's something that the US doesn't want to do, at least if the denials it issued right after Israel launched Operation Rising Lion are anything to go by. Within hours of Israel's initial attacks, US Senator Marco Rubio was denying any sort of US involvement. "We are not involved in strikes against Iran, and our top priority is protecting American forces in the region," Rubio stated in the wake of the strikes. "Let me be clear, Iran should not target US interests or personnel." While the statement was framed as a warning to Iran, Rubio's message reveals that the US doesn't want to be involved. It might not get its way. The BBC says that Iranian state TV is already lambasting the US for its past and current support of Israel, accusing it of being complicit in enabling Israel to launch an attack that has killed children. That's the last kind of rhetoric the US wants to hear. US President Donald Trump certainly wasn't happy. Just hours before Israel's strike, he said, "As long as I think that there will be an agreement, I don't want them going in." What agreement? Well, the US has spent the last couple of months talking with Iran to try to convince the country to halt its nuclear weapons development program. In Trump's own words, Israel's attack could blow these talks. Without those negotiations, the US may feel it has to follow through on the past threats to bomb Iran itself if it doesn't stop trying to build nuclear weapons. Then there are civilians to consider. On June 13th, Fox 4 KFDW News reported that several volunteer veteran-led groups were already working to get US civilians out of Israel as quickly as possible. They include Grey Bowl Rescue and Project Dynamo, both of which the outlet says have deployed people on the ground. The former group is based in Florida and has already been involved in around 730 of these types of rescue missions around the world. Project Dynamo is deploying several teams into Israel to get Americans out of the country. The existence of these groups raises a clear problem. US citizens are in Israel. Consider what this could mean when it comes to US involvement in the war between Iran and Israel. Iran is already sending hordes of drones and ballistic missiles to Israel. What happens if one of those weapons kills a US civilian, or even a member of one of the evacuation groups? Could the US sit back and allow that to happen without any sort of response? Trump might be forced into action. And the US president is already suggesting that could be a possibility. On June 15th, ABC News reported that the Trump administration is reiterating that it had no involvement in Operation Rising Lion. But if Iran hurts US civilians or personnel, Trump suggests the US could be drawn into the fight. "We're not involved in it," ABC reported Trump as saying. "It's possible we could get involved, but we are not at this moment involved." It's possible, says Trump. And if the possibility turns into reality, it would turn what is currently a regional conflict into a global war. That may be what Israel wants. As Vox reported on June 13th, it's long been believed that a military strike capable of fully degrading Iran's nuclear weapons production potential would require US involvement. According to the New York Times, the US even rejected a proposed Israeli attack plan that the outlet says would have required US help not just to defend Israel from Iranian retaliation, but also to ensure that an Israeli attack was successful. Iran is already arguing US is complicit, even if it isn't directly involved. According to American Friends Service Committee, or AFSC, the October 7, 2023 Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel served as a trigger for the US to start transferring enormous amounts of weapons to Israel. Between October 7th and December 25th, 2023, the AFSC says the US sent 10,000 tons of weapons to Israel, including 15,000 bombs and 50,000 artillery shells. From October 2023 to March 24, the US approved over 100 military sales to Israel, with only 2 of those being publicly disclosed at the time. Add to that the $3.8 billion the US already provides to Israel's military annually, according to the AFSC, and you get a potential powder keg. The BBC points out that only the US has the bunker-busting bombs that could take out Iran's underground nuclear facilities, but also delivers a warning. If America were to become an active combatant, that would represent a huge escalation with a long, potentially devastating consequential tail. but maybe the US doesn't get involved. That doesn't mean the war between Israel and Iran can't escalate, which brings us to our second worst-case scenario. The Gulf nations get dragged into the fight. That wouldn't necessarily be a surprise, claims the BBC. It points out that Saudi Arabia accused Iran of attacking its oil fields back in 2019, with the United Arab Emirates claiming in 2022 that the Houthis, which are believed to be an Iranian proxy, attacked its territory in 2022. Since then, there's been an uneasy peace between these Gulf nations, a peace that may soon be shattered. The BBC brings up the possibility that Iran may refocus its missile and drone strikes if it's unable to do any consequential damage to Israel. If Iran failed to damage Israel's well-protected military and other targets, then it could always aim its missiles at softer targets in the Gulf, the BBC says, especially countries that Iran believes aided and abetted its enemies over the years. Some of those Gulf nations are already worried. The Times of Israel says that several are quietly applauding Israel's Operation Rising Lion, but they're also wary about what the strikes could mean for them. The outlet quotes Sanam Vakil, who's the director of the Chatham House Middle East and North Africa program, as saying, "Gulf states are very much caught between a rock and a hard place, though they are quietly applauding the further weakening of Iran. They face real risks and have to play their cards carefully. Saudi Arabia is already trying to play its cards." Hours after Israel's strikes in Iran, the country's foreign ministry posted a statement to X to condemn the strikes. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia expresses its strong condemnation and denunciation of the blatant Israeli aggressions against the Brotherly Islamic Republic of Iran, which undermine its sovereignty and security and constitute a clear violation of international laws and norms, read the statement. Saudi Arabia also called on the international community to bring a stop to Israel's aggression. As Bakil says, it's a rock and a hard place situation. The Gulf states don't want to get involved in the fight because they realize that their involvement would weaken their own positions as well as Iran. That forces countries like Saudi Arabia into a balancing act, according to DW. It quotes Sebastian Sams of the Carpo think tank, who points out that Saudi Arabia has spent the last few years trying to de-escalate the tensions between itself and its regional rivals. However, that de-escalation may not be possible. Why? As Sons explains, Saudi Arabia finds itself in the eye of the storm and fears there might be attacks on its own territory because US troops are stationed there, and therein lies a problem. Iran attacking other Gulf states could bring the US into the fight, making the second worst-case scenario an escalation over the first. According to Al Jazeera on June 15th, the US currently maintains at least 19 military sites in the Middle East that have between 40,000 and 50,000 troops stationed up. Kuwait hosts 5 of those sites. 2 each are in Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. There are also US military sites in Oman, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. If Iran decides to strike further afield, it can also hit US military sites in Turkey and Cyprus, dragging both of them into the fight. The BBC suggests that some of these nations even helped Israel to defend itself, albeit discreetly, from Iranian missile attacks in 2024. That made some targets for Iran. Complicit nations allied with the US, which Iran believes is allied with Israel. An attack on any of these nations could drag them into a new Gulf war that, almost by association, given its military bases, the US might feel obligated to take part in. But let's move away from the nations that could get dragged into the fight for a moment and look at one of the things Israel wanted to achieve with Operation Rising Lion: decimating Iran's nuclear capabilities. Al Jazeera says that it's widely believed that Israel has nuclear weapons, though it's never confirmed this publicly. Even so, the mere suggestion that those nukes exist allow Israel to be a power player in the Middle East, because nuclear weapons provide a military advantage. Iran having nuclear weapons removes that advantage, which Al Jazeera says is a red line for Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu, who's Israel's prime minister, pointed to this fact when justifying Operation Rising Lion. He says Iran could have produced a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, or it could be a few months. Al Jazeera also quotes an unnamed Israeli official who claims that Iran has enough fissile material for 15 nuclear bombs within days. That brings us to the BBC's worst-case scenario. Israel's strikes don't destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. The worst-case scenario is entirely dependent on how close Iran is to building a nuclear weapon. Israel certainly believes it's on the cusp. It may not be wrong. CNN points out that Iran has the capability to enrich uranium, potentially to the point where it could build nuclear weapons. It notes that it all comes down to uranium-235, which is an isotope found in natural uranium. According to CNN, natural uranium is made up of 99.3% uranium-238, which is practically useless for both bombs and nuclear power, and 0.7% uranium-235. To make natural uranium useful for nuclear power, Iran has to enrich it so that its uranium-235 percentage is about 3.67%. All of that will be fine. The problem is that Iran has enriched large quantities of uranium to the point where it has 60% uranium-235. That's still not enough to create a nuclear bomb, which typically requires 90% enriched uranium. But it means Iran won't have to spend much time on further enrichment if it goes down the nuclear road. Iran Watch says as much, noting that it believes Iran has up to 593 pounds of uranium enriched to 60%. Theoretically, Iran Watch says it would only take Iran about 2 weeks to pull that percentage up to 90, leaving it with enough enriched uranium to build between 5 and 8 nuclear weapons. Israel would have a problem if that happened. That's why Operation Rising Lion targeted 3 Iranian nuclear sites: Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan. According to CNN, satellite images along with expert analysis suggest that Israel managed to cause significant damage to 2 of these sites. It also quotes Ali Vaez of the International Crisis Group as saying, "The whole nuclear supply chain has been disrupted. This chain is now broken, but it could be put back together in a matter of months because Iran has both the know-how and the material that is required for it." Baez concludes, "This is not a problem that will go away simply with aerial strikes. Therein lies Israel's issue. It doesn't have the aerial capacity to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities forever. As we mentioned earlier, it would need the US bunker-busting bombs to even come close. If Iran can rebuild, we could only be months away from it building a nuclear weapon and changing the entire complexion of the Gulf region. What if Israel's attack convinces Iran's leadership that its only way of deterring further attacks is to race for nuclear capability as fast as it can?" the BBC asks. It's possible. Avoiding that situation could force Israel into further attacks, escalating the situation further. Iran making that decision would also anger the US, which is actively negotiating with Iran to curtail its nuclear activities. So you get the specter of US involvement again, only this time, the war will be fought with a version of Iran that has nuclear weapons. How long would Iran allow itself to be battered by airstrikes before it uses those nukes? It's a question that nobody wants to see answered. And it's not just the prospect of Iran getting nuclear weapons that should cause the world to worry. The BBC's 4th worst-case scenario is that the emerging war between Iran and Israel causes a global economic shock. We can already see the start of this shock happening with oil prices. By mid-afternoon on June 13th, oil prices had already risen by 7%. Brent crude, which the BBC calls the main international benchmark of oil pricing, rose by more than 10% before settling down to around $74 to $75 per barrel. Well, that price still means that Brent crude is 10% lower than in 2024 and significantly lower than the $130 it spiked to when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. We also have to remember the energy crisis those previous spikes have caused. In several countries, these rising oil prices have the potential to cause stagflation. This is a term used to describe a situation in which persistent high inflation combines with high unemployment and a stagnant economy. And it's a problem that could soon affect many nations. The Guardian reports on comments made by Matt Gertken, who was a geopolitical analyst with BCA Research on June 14th. We've already seen a minor oil price spike, yet Israel has not finished its campaign and Iran has not fully retaliated. In the worst-case scenario, which now has 45% odds, we could see Iran retaliate, the US enter the fray, and oil prices double as Iran strikes regional oil supply. We've seen the first major Iranian retaliation with its missile strike against Israel. The mentions of the US along with Iran hitting regional oil supplies brings the first and second worst case scenarios the BBC mentioned into the equation. Neither has happened yet, but it shows that the world is currently on a knife edge when it comes to Iran's ability to affect oil prices. Any oil supply shock will have global implications, Gertken adds, reminding the world of the US's inherent advantages weighing on European and Chinese economies and playing into Russia's hands in Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin may see an opportunity here. Higher oil prices caused by Iran attacking other nations' supplies could allow him to finesse his way back toward making Russian oil a needed commodity, especially in Europe. And it gets worse on the economic front. What if Iran reactivates the Houthis in the Red Sea? The attacks the militant group started in 2024 had already cost the Egyptian economy $6 billion by November 4th of that year, says the maritime executive. Traffic through the Suez Canal was done up to 70% at various points during the year as container ship operators were forced to divert and take much longer routes. Those routes affected supply chains and product prices. All of this would weigh heavily on global economies trying to absorb the shock of the oil price rises a war between Iran and Israel would cause. So we get a combination of a global economic shock combined with the revitalization of Russia's oil sales. For Putin, that would mean the ability to drag the Ukraine war out longer, at a time when Ukraine's allies, particularly the US, have their attention diverted by the fight between Iran and Israel. Russia could end up being the big winner in the wake of this fourth worst-case scenario. Finally, there's one more scenario the BBC envisions. One that seems like a strange worst case at first until you consider the implications. Iran loses and the regime falls. That seems like a strange worst case scenario, given that it's exactly what Israel wants to achieve. Iran's current regime falling would eliminate the prospect of it having nuclear weapons, which solves one problem, and would also minimize Iran's attacks on oil fields that could cause an economic shock. However, the loss of the current regime also creates a power vacuum in the Middle East, a vacuum that several nations would rush to fill. What vacuum could it leave? The BBC asks about the possibility of Israel eliminating Iran's current regime. What unforeseen consequences would there be? What would civil conflict in Iran look like? These are questions for which we don't have answers right now, but we can look to the states of countries like Iraq and Libya. Both lost strong central governments, albeit dictatorial ones, and both are now shadows of their former selves. The same could happen to Iran, which would dramatically alter the power balance in the Middle East. Forbes senior contributor Paul Iden highlights this problem in a June 15th article. He points out that former Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein's loss during the Gulf War led to his military being neutered. This was a fighting force that once numbered 1 million active soldiers and had fought Iran to a stalemate before the US got involved. A vacuum was created. With Iraq neutered, Iran was able to rise as the Middle East power broker it is today. Iden says that Netanyahu saw all of this coming, noting, "It's worth remembering that Netanyahu has been warning about the imminent dangers of a nuclear Iran since at least 1995. The point here is that we've seen this worst-case scenario play out before. The fall of Iraq gave rise to a more powerful Iran. Would Iran's fall, be it to Israel alone or a combined global effort, lead to the rise of another nation that could become a threat to the global order? We've already talked about how the economic shockwaves created in the oil sector could empower Russia. Putin might see an opportunity to move into a devastated Iran, bolstered by the anti-West sentiment that would surely exist in the country following a war with Israel. China might do the same. These are two global geopolitical heavyweights that have the potential to get even stronger if Iran's regime falls. The Middle East Forum also points out that both the Kurds and Baloch populations in Iran could see an opportunity to rise if the current regime falls. Both resist Iran's current regime. The Kurds call for a secular and federalist version of Iran that revolves around a decentralized government. The Baloch population may finally see an opportunity to separate from Iran entirely. After all, it was only in October 2024 that the Middle East Research Institute reported on comments made by Baloch leader Haibi al-Mari that the Baloch are part of a nation that is currently under Iranian occupation. Without Iran's regime to stop them, the Balochs may separate into their own nation state. There are so many questions about what all of these scenarios could mean for the future if Iran's regime falls. Is the case of better the devil you know than the one you don't? We'll only know if this final worst-case scenario comes to pass. For now, Israel is trying to hit as many Iranian officials and political leaders as possible with Operation Rising Lion. Check out our video covering the outcome of the initial strikes last